Welcome. Welcome to the Economic Sciences Prize Lectures 2016. As a very brief introduction, if you look at introductory textbooks in economics, they describe transactions in a very simple way. There's a seller who's producing something and he sells it, and there's a buyer who pays a price and consumes this good, and that's it. That's the transaction. But of course, you know that in reality, many transactions are much more complicated, and they are supported by more or less complicated contracts. For example, employment contracts are typically quite complicated, or financial contracts. This picture is supposed to illustrate what can go wrong if the contract is not quite well designed. Is it self-explanatory? I think so. I give you a few seconds to figure it out. But moving on to this year's laureates, Oliver Hart and Bengt Holmström, they are rewarded for their contributions to contract theory. And we're going to start alphabetical order. We're going to start with Oliver Hart. And here are just a few stats. He was born in London. He got his PhD from Princeton. And he's now a professor of economics at Harvard University. And I would like to invite Professor Hart to come up on stage and give his prize lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. Let me begin by saying that I'm absolutely thrilled to have been awarded this prize. That's no surprise. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to talk about the work that led to it. For me, that work started in 1983, the summer of 1983, when Sanford Grossman and I asked ourselves the following question: why would one firm ever buy another firm rather than conduct business with that firm through a contract? In other words, what are the limits of contracts? Now, we knew that Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson, among others, had written on this topic, but we also knew that their work was unformalized. As economic theorists, our goal was to develop a formal model of the difference between arm's-length contracting and integration, or a merger, purchasing a firm. We worked intensively for 10 days. With apologies to John Reed, and here I'm talking about the American journalist who died in 1920, not the former CEO of Citigroup, it was 10 days that shook my world. At some point, we realized that the key elements to understanding the difference are contractual incompleteness and residual control, or residual decision rights. So, to illustrate the ideas, consider the somewhat unfashionable case of a power plant that locates next to a coal mine with the purpose of burning the coal to make electricity. So this is a real-world example, and such relationships often last for decades. How to manage the relationship? One possibility is for the power plant and the coal mine to remain as separate companies and to have an arm's-length long-term contract with each other. So the contract would specify the quantity, quality, and price of coal for many years to come. The problem is that any such contract will be incomplete. Events will occur that the parties could not fully foresee when they started out. For example, suppose that the power plant needs the coal to be pure, but that it is hard to specify in advance what purity means, given that there are many potential impurities. Imagine that 10 years on, ash content is the relevant impurity, and that high ash content coal is more expensive for the power plant to burn, but cheaper for the coal mine to produce. Given that the contract is incomplete, the coal mine may be within its rights under the contract to supply high ash content coal. The contract simply wasn't explicit enough to rule that out. Now, the power plant can, of course, do something about that. It can try to renegotiate the contract, but it may find that it has to pay the coal mine a large sum of money to persuade it to switch from the cheap high ash content coal to the more expensive low ash content coal. In other words, the coal mine may have the power plant over a barrel. That may not be the best word to use in this context, because I don't think we normally think of barrels of coal, we normally think of barrels of oil, but you get the idea. The point is that the coal mine is in a very strong position because the power plant has a very poor alternative. It's located right next to this coal mine, and to get coal from anywhere else would be very expensive. So economists call this the hold-up problem. It occurs when one party, Party A, is very dependent on another party, Party B, and then Party B may have does have the ability, in principle, to behave in a very opportunistic way and to force Party A to pay a great deal to get what it wants from Party B. Okay, so the idea is that this coal mine that is located next to the power plant and has this incomplete contract will anticipate that, sorry, did I say that? I may have said that the wrong way around. The power plant, I have to keep these two things clear in my mind. The power plant locating next to the coal mine realizes that it may be held up by the coal mine later on, and that may make it reluctant to become totally dependent on the coal mine for its source of coal. It may be reluctant to locate right next to it. So it's worth going into a little more detail about the source of this hold-up power. Grossman and I argued that it arises because the owner of the coal mine has residual rights of control over the mine, the right to decide on uses of the coal mine about which the contract is silent. And because the contract is incomplete, there will be a lot of things it's silent about. So in this case, the key residual right of control is the decision about what kind of coal to mine. So the point is that because the coal mine is a separate entity, the owner of the coal mine can decide whether to mine the high ash content coal or the low ash content coal, and the power plant will have to pay the owner to do something other than what the owner naturally wants. Okay, so is there anything the power plant can do to avoid this hold-up situation? Short of writing a better contract, a more complete contract, one thing it could do is to buy the coal mine in advance. That way, the power plant, as owner of the coal mine, will have the key residual control right. So now the power plant, as owner of the coal mine, can decide what kind of coal to take out of the mine. So the coal mine can no longer extract a high price by threatening to produce high ash content coal. The power plant can order the coal mine manager to mine low ash content coal, and if the coal mine manager, for some reason, is particularly enthusiastic about high ash content coal and is becoming stubborn about that, the power plant can simply fire or sack the coal mine manager and replace the manager with somebody else. The key point is they still have access to the mine because it belongs to them. So one result of this is that the power plant may now be more willing to become completely dependent on the coal mine because it's no longer worried about being taken advantage of. And this is the benefit of integration. Integration here meaning the purchase of the coal mine by the power plant. But, and this is very important, there is also a cost of integration because the manager of the coal mine, who say previously owned the mine and now becomes simply an employee of the power plant, is going to find himself more vulnerable. He loses power, and so he has fewer residual control rights, and he becomes more vulnerable. For example, suppose that this manager has an idea about how to mine coal more efficiently. If the manager owns the coal mine, he can be confident about reaping the returns of this idea, because the costs will go down, profits will go up, and as owner, he will be able to pocket those extra profits. But if he's merely an employee, his position is much less secure. For example, the power plant could say, when he produces this good idea for making things more efficient, the power plant owner could say, well, thank you very much, but now that I have your idea, I don't need you anymore. I can implement it and get the returns myself. And anticipating this, the manager, when he becomes an employee, has a lower incentive to have ideas, to innovate. Bottom line, integration has costs as well as benefits, and you have to balance the two. Now, in a 1990 paper with John Moore, I generalized the analysis to the case of many assets and workers. In my example, there were just 2 assets and 2 managers, but we generalized the analysis to the case of many assets and many people. And we also considered more complicated ownership structures, not just whether I own the mine or you own the mine, but various forms of joint or common ownership. There are 2 main differences from the previous literature that I want to highlight. The first is that the analysis is more formal. Now, unfortunately, you can't see that at all today because I've just used words, but let me assure you, you can translate this into the kind of formal models that economists like. And indeed, you know, it was only by doing that we got the words right, the ideas right. But you'll have to wait for the written lecture to see how that is done. The other point is that the focus is on, in this theory, is on the control over physical, or more generally, non-human assets, rather than authority or control over people. So just to give you a sense of that, ownership of the coal mine would not yield much to the power plant if the manager of the coal mine is indispensable, if his human capital is essential for making things work, because then this manager would still be able to hold up the power plant, even if the power plant owns the coal mine, because the manager can just say, I refuse to produce low ash content coal unless you pay me a huge amount. And the point is, what can the power plant do if this guy is the only person in the world who can actually figure out how to get the coal out of the mine? So it's important for the story that human capital is somewhat replaceable. Okay, well as helping us to understand mergers, this approach has other applications. One is to corporate finance. So in the electricity coal example, I want you to still think about this, but except I want you to replace the power plant by a financial investor. That is, let's consider the case where the coal mine needs money to expand or modernize, and it doesn't have the money itself. So it approaches someone with deep pockets, an investor. How does it get the investor to agree to put up this money? Well, it obviously has to be provide some sort of assurance that the investor is going to get a return. And one way it can do that is by promising some share of future profit. But this may not be enough. The problem is that the contract between the... did I skip a... No, that's right, I suppose. The contract between the investor and the coal mine is likely to be incomplete for the same kinds of reasons as I mentioned before, difficulty of anticipating the future. The investor will therefore be worried about opportunistic behavior, which is similar to hold-up, by the manager of the coal mine. For example, the manager of the coal mine could, instead of, I've promised you a profit share, a good profit share, but what I could do is, instead of paying out profits to you as you want, I could divert the earnings. I could pay myself a large salary instead of paying out profits, or I could take those profits and reinvest them in activities that you might not approve of, rather than paying you back. So even though I promised you a good share of the profits, this may not be enough to give you confidence that you're going to get a return on your investment. What can be done? Well, one way to protect the investor against opportunism is by giving her residual control rights or votes. For example, the investor could become, remember we have this investor in the coal mine that's modernizing, the investor could become the owner of the coal mine rather than having an arm's length contract with the coal mine. And this would allow the investor to intervene to stop opportunistic behavior, before it happened. For example, the investor could control the manager's salary, could say, no, you're not going to get a raise this year, or the investor could even replace the manager. But as we've seen, there can be a downside for the manager of the coal mine if control rights are given to the investor. The manager's incentive to have ideas may be reduced if the investor has control, just as in the case of the coal mine, if the power plant has control. So in a paper written in 1989 and published in 1998, John Moore and I showed that under some assumptions, the optimal way of balancing these things, the desire to persuade the investor that they're going to break even on their investment or make a decent return on their investment, but at the same time, the desire to give the manager an incentive to have ideas and all the nice things that go with when the manager has control rights. The best way to balance that can be for the contract to be a debt contract. And what that means in particular here is that the coal mine promises to make a fixed stream of payments to the investor. As long as these payments are made, the manager of the coal mine remains in charge. So the manager retains control as long as she's making the payments. I think it's a he, actually. I think the manager's a he and the investor's a she. I always get confused about that. But anyway, if a payment is not made, control shifts to the investor. And the investor can then decide whether to replace the manager or sell the mine or do various other things. Okay? So what's good about this is that, remember the problems that I talked about. The manager's opportunism was paying himself a very high salary or reinvesting earnings. Well, he's got a sort of tight budget constraint. If he doesn't make the payments as promised to the investor, he's going to be in trouble, he's going to lose control. So that's going to give him an incentive to behave less opportunistically. Debt contracts are, of course, ubiquitous, and the analysis, I think, helps to explain why they are used. It also casts light on the importance of collateral. The investor is better protected if the physical assets of the mine are important relative to the manager's human capital. Because in this case, the investor is not worried about being held up by the manager. Because if the manager is difficult, the investor can replace the manager, and the physical assets themselves are very valuable in the hands, let's say, of another manager. or liquidated or whatever, sold off. So in a case like that, where the physical assets are important relative to the manager's human capital, it will be quite easy for the coal mine to borrow quite a lot. In contrast, and this is similar to the point I made earlier, if the manager's human capital is terribly important, then of course the investor knows, well, yes, I can seize the physical assets if a debt payment isn't made, but what use is that to me, because it's the manager's human capital that is essential. So in that case, the investor will be more reluctant to lend, so the coal mine won't be able to borrow so much. The analysis can also tell us about the maturity of debt contracts. So if the physical assets are not only valuable relative to the human capital, but also depreciate quite slowly, then the investor will be comfortable with a long-term debt contract because she's protected, right? She's protected because if the manager is difficult, she can always seize those assets and they're still worth a lot even several years into the future. In contrast, if the assets depreciate very fast, then the investor will only be protected if we have a short-term debt contract. So empirical support for these ideas is there, fortunately, and it exists in the work of Ben Melek, among others. Okay, so that's one application to understand the balance of control in financial contracting. And actually, I would like to mention also the work of Aguillon and Bolton on this topic, where I had a slide on this, but I got very nervous about time. And so my apologies to them and to some very fine empirical work by Kaplan and Stromberg. That'll have to wait till the written lecture. Okay, a second application. How am I doing, by the way? 10 minutes. Oh, that's great. Okay. A second application is to public versus private ownership. And I investigated this in a 1997 paper with Andrei Schleifer and Robert Vishny. So I want you now to replace the power plant by the government. Okay? So instead of having the power plant now, we have the government. And instead of having the coal mine, let us have a prison. So the situation now is the government wants prison services, okay? People are going to be in the prison, incarcerated. Perhaps we don't want them to be treated too badly. And so the government has an interest in getting the right treatment of the prisoners, and this is like the power plant wanting the right kind of coal. But just as in that earlier example, there are two ways of organizing this transaction. The government can contract with a private company to provide the prison services, to run the prison, maybe even to build and run the prison. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is that the government can own and control the prison, and then the people who work in the prison, the warden and the guards and so on, will be government employees. That's like the power plant buying the coal mine. So which is better? Well, again, it boils down to contractual incompleteness and the allocation of residual control rights. If the prison is privately run, then there's going to be this contract with the private company to look after the prisoners, but any such contract is going to be incomplete. And that means that the prison company later on may find a way consistent with the contract to save money at the expense of quality, which is undesirable for the government and society. For example, the company might find a way to hire cheaper but less qualified, less well-trained guards. Okay, so this is something which is good for their bottom line, but not so good for society, because these guards may not be very good at dealing with violent situations that might arise in the prison. So this kind of action by the private company is analogous to the coal mine choosing to mine high ash content coal when the power company would prefer low ash content coal. So this is something, if the government owns the prison, it can stop this happening. If the warden shows some inclination to hire these less well-trained guards, the government can say, no, you're not allowed to do that because that's our decision. We have the residual control right. On the other hand, a privately run prison might have a greater incentive to innovate, to be more efficient, and to innovate, actually, to be more efficient in terms of reducing costs, but also to innovate, say, by coming up with socially valuable rehabilitation programs. So this is something where the incentive may be greater in the private case than in the public case, for the same reason that I argued that the manager of the coal mine might not have incentives to innovate, to have ideas, if he becomes an employee of the power plant rather than owning the coal mine himself. Okay, so which effect is more important will determine. So one is the benefit of the government being able to intervene and stop these poorly trained guards being hired. That's a plus of government ownership. But on the other hand, the stifling of innovation or efficiency is a minus of government ownership. So which effect is more important will determine whether public or private ownership is better. In our 1997 paper, we argued that the first effect is likely to dominate the second in the case of maximum security prisons, where the quality of the guards is particularly important. So here, dealing with violent situations is particularly important, and so we thought having the government with the residual control rights would be a good thing, and so public provision would be better. But there are, of course, other cases where the trade-off goes the other way, and privatization is good, and garbage collection, rubbish collection, we thought is a leading case of that. I think one thing which is perhaps useful about the analysis is that it shows that economics rather than politics can guide us with respect to the public-private choice. This often ends up being an ideological matter when you hear people arguing about it. But what this says is, no, we should really think about it in economic efficiency terms. Or at least that's a useful perspective. Okay, well, I think I'm close to the end. So let me just say, if I had more time, I would talk about my recent work over the last 10 years or so, where I've introduced behavioral elements. In particular, are concerned by the contracting parties for a reasonable or fair outcome to understand at a deeper level why contracts are incomplete. Don't have time for that, which is a pity. I would also talk about two legal cases I was involved in where I used the work I've described as an expert witness for the US government. This will all be, so this is all, I'm holding this back to give you an incentive to read the lecture, the written lecture, when it is finally available. Let me end then by just acknowledging some of my co-authors in this endeavor. So here you have, it looks as if my co-author is the Continental Divide, or maybe it's that mountain over there. But if you look very carefully, you will see someone in the middle, and that is Sanford Grossman. Another important collaborator who can be seen much more clearly is John Moore. On the prisons paper, my co-authors were Andrei Schleifer and Robert Vishny. And then on the behavioral work, which I haven't had time to talk about, that was theoretical, but I also carried out some experiments, lab experiments at some point, with the help of Christian Zender and Ernst Fehr. Now, I know that I had a notable co-author, but, and this must be age, I just cannot remember his name. Can you help me? All right, on that note, I think I will end. Thank you. Go this way.
No, go that way, I guess. Well,
I was told.
Okay. Let's trip on that thing. Thank you very much. The next lecture is going to be given by Professor Bengt Holmström, and here are his stats. He was born in Helsinki. He got his PhD from Stanford, and he's now a professor of economics and management at MIT. And I would like to invite Professor Holmström to come up here and give his lecture.
Thank you too much. I want to thank the Academy, the Royal Academy, for bestowing us with this great honor. And thank you all for coming. There are a lot of friends here. It's very difficult to see from here where they are, but it's much appreciated. And I must say that I'm delighted to share this prize with my somewhat senile friend Oliver, who is very close to me. I want to try to say something about my work, obviously, but I also want to try to convey in this lecture a little bit how we think, or I at least think about theory. I'm a theorist. And you know, economics may sometimes seem like it's either incomprehensibly stupid or trivial, but nothing in between. And I'm going to try to explain some of the thinking that may seem obvious, but actually requires some further thought. And so that's was telling something about my journey is basically the plan, a narrative of how I got into incentives and what were key steps in one of the strands of what I've done, especially motivating workers. So in some sense it complements Oliver's talk in that I'm focused more on contracts, broadly construed, and I'm also focused on contracts within the firm rather than between firms. I want to say a word about how I got into it because it's unusual, slightly unusual. I didn't plan to be an economist, and I didn't start off on that track. I went off, I was a mathematician, an applied mathematician. I went to work for a firm in Finland that's called Holmström. It was one of the top 10 firms and a progressive firm. It's a big conglomerate. It had 30 factories or so. And I was hired for a very specific task, which was to implement a big corporate planning model. Corporate planning models of that sort don't exist anymore, and I hope for some of the reasons I will explain. But that was the rage at the time. Any progressive firm would want to have a big planning model. We are talking about a linear programming model, for those who know what that means. Thousands of equations, thousands of activities, 5-year out, plans about investment, plans about production, all how they depend and integrate, describing sort of the inner workings of the firm. It was terrific in the sense that it was a wonderful way for somebody like me who was a mathematician to actually come to learn about how a big company works. I got to work with the CFO, not with the CEO, a very charismatic CFO who was a very tough guy, but somehow took a liking to me because he liked that I said what I thought. And he would then say pretty often when I thought wrongly. But we got along very well. And so I started on this work by collecting information from these factories. I went out to the factories and talked to them, and it didn't take very long to realize that this seemed like a pretty meaningless task, in the sense that, what these guys were in the factories worried about was, first of all, that, some new gadget comes and, somehow screws up their life. But secondly, they were gaming it. They were sort of asking indirectly, almost directly questions. What should I put in to get maximally things out for myself? And I don't think they were doing it to cheat people, but they had the view that headquarters didn't know what they were doing, and so they had to somehow adjust, not send the numbers that were true, but send some other numbers so that would kind of correct what the headquarters thought about. So I could see that there were, the two sides of the problem was neither side somehow had the full information, and this was a complicated problem, completely swamping the problem of actually calculating this gigantic model, which itself was, of course, complicated. So I suggested that let's scan it. And subsequently I heard they thought for a moment to fire me, but the CFO saved me and said, let's put him to work on something else. And the something else was very small models, incentive models, and various versions of how do we incentivize these people in the right way. Looking at it now, pretty pathetic, but I tried my best. Models about incentives and so on. And then I got the lucky draw, which was I was awarded a scholarship to go to Stanford for a sabbatical from this firm. And the lucky draw really wasn't just Stanford. It was that I realized incentives was actually also an interest of economists at the time. And I got to go to Bob Wilson's class, which was an iconic class at the business school. Bob Wilson subsequently became an advisor. I'm very glad that he's here with us here today. And I asked him about the incentives, and he pointed me to work that was worth reading. First I thought it was gibberish, but eventually I started to realize it was actually made kind of sense. I don't know if you will think that way. So that's how I ended up where I am right now. And I feel pretty pleased about it. So I write paper for performance and beyond because I have a very simple narrative in the sense that, I went there like most people. I thought that paper performance is the thing, the sort of medicine for incentive problems. And after 30 or so years of studying it, I'm more or less thinking pay for performance, to simplify, is the problem. And if this sounds like the Republicans, maybe it is. But I'm going to start with a simple paper performance story, the way we studied it in the early days. And by the way, Wilson wrote a very early paper on it in '69, and Steve Ross, another friend, in '73, and so on. So there was a literature that I began with, and I will start from that literature and then show you how I developed it together with co-authors, how I developed it further into the view that I was just suggesting, that this problem is much more than about pay for performance. So I call it the principal agent problem. That's the language we use. I'm not going to use any equations and such. I had such slides, but I decided to take it away because I'm trying to explain it. It's a canonic model, a sort of simplified model of a complicated situation where there's just one principal, a boss, say, an employee is the agent, the employer is the boss. It could be a client who is the boss in the case of hiring a lawyer who is the agent. It could be the board, which is the boss, and the CEO, who is the agent, and so on. It's a model that kind of just studies the question of what kind of incentive pay would be suitable in a very generic context. And there are two difficulties that makes the model is the interest of the model. And that is preferences are not aligned and performance are imperfectly measured. And these two things make the problem a complication. And I come to that just in a second. But then, secondly, there's the incentive is, as I said, just a contract where based on measured performance, which, as I said just a moment ago, was imperfect. So that's the setup. And it's good usually, we usually start with saying what is the first best, meaning if we didn't have these problems, what would be the solution? And actually, Thomas already mentioned it, but the first best cases are two. Actually, there are three, but I want to just mention two. Agent's choice is verifiable, so we can actually observe what you are doing, what the employee is doing. In that case, the contract is just written so that it says, do this, or then you don't get any pay, or you get a punishment, or something like that. So it's and then because the agent typically is risk averse, and that's, did I mention the risk aversion, or? Yeah, it's a preference are not aligned. I should have mentioned it's because the agent is risk averse and the principal is risk neutral. So the agent doesn't like to carry risk. So the ideal is to pay the agent a fixed wage if the agent didn't have any action that would have to be incentivized. The other case is where the agent is risk neutral, in which case doesn't worry about the risk and therefore could carry the whole risk for himself. This is the case we call a rental agreement, or the agent is a residual claimant. Just to give you a sense, taxi cab drivers typically are on this scheme. It's very difficult to measure their performance, so they actually are residual claimants. They rent the car from somebody who owns the car and then get the most, if not all of the income from driving. This gives the right incentives. They are like, their own owner when they are driving. But in the general case, the second best is in this model one about balancing incentives against risk. And rather than saying how this is studied and so on, let me say my contribution to this part was to try to understand how this model was thinking. This is a very big part of the way I look at this theory. It's an experiment. It's crucial to try to understand how the model thinks. And then if we can't do that, then that's not a model that I typically like to work on. So, and I emphasize the fact that sometimes you think you understand it, but you actually don't. So this informativeness principle may sound very simple. So it says that I asked the question, or actually it was asked before, the question of, instead of asking what should the incentive schemes look like, a preceding question is, what information is valuable for incentive contracting? And the answer sounds kind of silly or trivial. Anything that is informative about the agent's choice of action should go into it. And this is something that Steve Chauvel and I jointly discovered, and both papers were published together in the same volume. But what is not so trivial about this is that a lot of people actually thought at the time this is not the case. So the going view was that if some signal is noisy enough about what you are doing, then it's worthless. So this is, in that sense, a surprising answer. It is not the reason. Another way of looking at it is to look at an old accounting principle. So if you read accounting books in the times, they would say pay should only depend on variables that the agent can control. Sounds like a very sensible principle too. But if you look at the relative performance, to take one of the applications of the informativeness principle, you will see that relative performance means that if you do something and I'm paying you for it, I may want to see somebody else who's doing something similar to you and seeing how well is that person doing, and then based on that decide whether to pay you a lot or little or adjust the payment by sort of the circumstances. And the point is that because the agent is not the sole producer of the performance measure, there's luck, either bad luck or good luck, that also affects the performance measure. Then filtering out something about that noise that shouldn't be there, to get a better and more perfect performance measure, that's where the relative performance is very, very valuable. So actually, taking something the agent cannot control helps me take out something that the agent can't control in the original measure. That's the logic of why it is actually good, and thereby reducing the risk. And so the controllability principle got to be adjusted. Accountants changed the way they define controllability. The measure becomes more controllable thanks to relative performance evaluation. I think the informativeness principle wouldn't be talked about as much, or I'm not thinking so much about it I should say, by the way, that it has been used now as this aspect of my work has been heavily used for telling that CEOs should be paid for, not for luck, bad or good, but typically for good luck. So people, various corporate governance advocates are very big on this idea that their pay should be adjusted as a function of macroeconomic circumstances and so on. Doesn't seem to happen quite that way, and I don't want to get into that. For me, the informativeness, or for this narrative, the informativeness, the importance of it is that it tells exactly actually how the model thinks. So the fact that you get this principle holds it's saying that all the minute pieces of information about the agents, whether the agent did what sort of was expected of the agent, is relevant for evaluating the agent. What it explains several puzzles, and I come to one just shortly, but basically explains why the model tends to produce extremely complicated answers. You don't get a linear scheme, you don't get necessarily say, single bonus scheme or anything that you see in reality, or option or whatnot. That's the con part of this principle. It just basically says nothing about the shape, except for very rare circumstances. So it is oversensitive to the information. But it also, by being oversensitive, it does explain, we understand exactly how this thinks. And one place where it is especially important is in an example, a striking example that Merlis brought up in a paper in 1976, where he basically said that if you look at the simplest of examples, mathematical examples, where the agent puts in an effort and then you add a noise term, and the noise term is what we call normally distributed, meaning it's the very familiar bell-shaped distribution function that we all know about. This seems like the obvious example to look at. And this does not give a sensible sounding answer. The optimal incentive actually doesn't, first of all, exist, but you can approximate arbitrarily closely the first best by increasingly punishing the agent for increasingly bad outcomes. So somewhere far out in the tail, when you were supposed to perform at 100 and you get minus 10,000, then we really punish you hard. And that will keep you working just the way I want it. And for the most part, you are just paid a flat wage. Now, Paul Milgram and I looked at this example and drew. By the way, this, I should say, informativeness exactly explains why this is the case. Because the model, the tail of the normal distribution is hugely informative. And so this model you're paying the person exactly as a function of how much information there is in the outcome signal with regard to whether the agent did what was expected or not. So Paul Milgram and I looked at this example, and we I had been working for a while here. I wasn't happy with this model, the basic model. I was doing well in the labor market, but I wasn't feeling well because this work didn't seem to be right. I understood the model was correct, but it wasn't giving what we wanted. So I invited Paul to work with me, and this was, you talked about 10 days. I think we spent about a week or so, and we figured out It was a simpler problem, Oliver, don't worry. I think actually we spent 3 hours, but I didn't want to. Very simple answer. The linear incentive is optimal in our model, just to cut it short, is because it puts the same incentive pressure. It's not sensitive, linear schemes are not sensitive to the fine details of information. And another way of putting it is the Merle is extreme, it's a very extreme scheme to pay, you know, when you, in the very tail of a distribution. If you just change the situation a little bit, or you make another little, you know, your view of measurement error was not exactly correct, then it all falls apart. So the linear scheme was robust in a sense. And this, I would say that this has led to its own literature, and it sort of shifted the literature towards a view where we're actually looking at a model where the agent, just one little thing, such as the level of effort, is actually not the simplest case to study. It's about the most complicated thing to study, because the behavior of the model is so erratic, despite the seeming simplicity. And I think this is a very important thing, because a lot of people walked around and looked at Merle's case and said, you know, well, that's ridiculous, let's just study linear incentives, because it's simpler. This is not relevant for us. So this is I mean, you don't do theory in order to just dismiss a model that says you should really punish people at the very tail of the distribution, which is anything but linear, and then you say, okay, thank you for the advice, and then I just go and assume something. So this is, to me, a very deep lesson with regard to doing theory. We do theory to listen to what the model says, and then we go and find out why it's saying it. And in this case, it led to the insight that we were looking at the wrong kinds of models. So the models with one task, in this case, by the way, the dynamic model is one with a lot of actions, where the agent, the basic intuition is that the agent has a lot more control over his performance if he chooses things dynamically over time against the bonus or against the Merle scheme. But I don't want to speak about the linear model, except to say that the thing that caught the eye of Paul and me was the fact that, first of all, the linear model worked logically. You know, you ask it a question, so, you know, what about if there's less risk? Well, then you can pay the agent a steeper incentive because the agent is risk averse. What if the agent is less risk averse? Then you also pay a steeper incentive, that is a higher commission. What if the value of the agent's effort is higher? All these are right answers. Let me just explain. If you had asked these questions for the first model I was talking about, you would get no answer, or you could get completely crazy answers. So the thing that is, however, hidden in this answer, and that shows that when you look at this model in detail, is that there was a little detail in the story that we had ignored sort of for 10 years at least in this, which is that it also depended how much bang for the buck you get if you raise the incentive. And this comes from the agent's cost function. And it became important because it meant that actually you have another instrument than paying the agent. You can also perhaps change the cost function of the agent. So we got into the idea of multitasking, the idea of multiple instruments. And so let me give just a short review of the multitasking, or some examples. When you have many tasks, I think the game sort of for us changed completely. It was not about level effort, it's about do people allocate their effort correctly. And it's actually challenging because there are some tasks that are very easy to measure and there are some tasks that are hard to measure. And you have to sort of consider the fact that even though you can easily observe one, if you raise, say, take the quantity versus quality, where quantity usually is easy to measure, quality is hard to measure. If you raise the incentive on quantity, then that makes it harder to incentivize quality. And in fact, in the first instance, the agent will allocate away effort from quality into quantity. And we will see many examples like that. The same appears in short-term versus long-term decisions. If you push the short-term, you will have a problem with the long-term, and so on. And so let me jump to the scandals, which has been, which are very often functions of this multitasking problem. And there's even the saying of "you get what you pay for" is one of the problems. So Wells Fargo is a very recent case in the U.S. You know, the Wells Fargo workers were found to have manufactured, I think, over 1 million fake accounts. I mean, they had names like Holmström and Hart, but we didn't know that there were such accounts. And they were used, there was no money in it, but because they were paid for creating accounts and various products and selling them, then they got bonuses, and the life was happy for a couple of years, but no longer. And now I think about 5,000 people have been fired, and the CEO, of course, had to step out. So that's an example of where you start pushing people. It's not that they are evil, by the way. Some may be, but you know, that I don't believe that. That's not my experience. It's just that they are, so much is expected of them that they in some sort of some people lose it, and they just feel like they have to manufacture somehow in response to what's required in order to hold on to their job. So the BP and oil Gulf spill, which is I think in the memory of some of you, is a disastrous case of this, in that BP will highly incentivize. I mean, there are other stories of this, but I was actually working for McKinsey at the time and saw this closely. Very aggressive top-down demands that people should deliver, you know, discover oil, pump oil, you know, do what the wildcatters, the entrepreneurs, were doing so well. And I think it is clear that led to shading in terms of quality. Enron is an example of misaligned incentives. So this is an old problem. It actually goes back to General Motors and Fisher Body. Is that you have somebody working for you who is actually basically owning a subsidiary. You give the subsidiary to some, you incentivize these people for the subsidiary, but you don't realize that they are just going to, you know, they have total imbalance. They are 100% of the subsidiary or 1% of Enron. That's not a very natural situation or correct situation for incentives. And teachers are a big subject in the US right now, but teaching the test, which is not wrong in principle, but it just cuts into the value of having teachers actually teach students what they also need, namely social skills, verbal skills, presentation skills. All that is very hard to measure. So that leads to problems. And so what is the remedy? So the remedy here, and let's leave this, the sort of insight of multitasking is that there are two ways you can stimulate, presentation skills in school if you're a teacher. One, or get a teacher to allocate time for that. One is to pay more, somehow measure after all how they present these students, and, you know, have some context or have opinions about that. But the easier task typically is don't incentivize competing tasks. So it's actually a story that leads to these multitasking stories. Multitasking stories very much connected to low-powered incentives. That is, low-powered incentives in many, many situations, no incentive. Financial, monetary, pecuniary incentives is actually the best incentive for something else. So even if something is perfectly measurable and on its own that task could be perfectly incentivized, first best as I called it, you actually don't do anything. You ignore that information, and your pay is independent of it. The idea which floats around a lot also, and people have an instinct, and workers like, well, pay me for what I can control. That can be very dangerous and damaging for the same reason. Because it's easy to produce results, but it's the wrong kinds of results. So I come to the important corollary of this multitasking is multiple instruments. You say, well, what do I do if I can't incentivize? I can't pay anything. You know, pay for performance is not the right rule. The answer is there are alternatives inside the firm especially. And it sort of builds on this red thing at the bottom. Employees want to be appreciated. You know, I've spent 13 years on the Nokia board. We got every year these yearly evaluations of what workers like and don't like about Nokia. In the top 3 always, I would love to know better what my boss wants me to do. That is, there is this craving that in the firm, you try to influence people's views of you. It's you know, you want to do good perhaps, but above all, you want to be appreciated. You want to know what will it take to be appreciated. It's a little bit like one of the emails I got about the Nobel Prize. What should I do to get a Nobel Prize, it said. You know, there was another person who wanted to be appreciated. So the other thing is, so then the job design is a very important way. So you have these sort of weaker measures or drivers of performance. Then you can, the firm has a lot of instruments used for channeling that energy, if you wish, or the desire. And that is through job design. You can split up, for instance, dealing with this easy to measure or hard to measure. You can split up the jobs. You have 2 different kinds of teachers, those that just teach math and those that teach performance or speaking skills or whatever is hard to measure. Bureaucratic rules, which people tend to think, I mean, that's the vogue now. How do we incentivize this poorly performing government? The answer is, in general, you don't. You know, when people come with the ideas that they should come and bring incentive base into the government, that is very, very frustrating. So there's just, here's authority, career path, supervision, recruiting. There's just tons of instruments inside the firm. So the firm can, first of all, much more powerfully tap into the desire of people to be appreciated. And that opens up all other instruments that are non-pecuniary, non-performance, pay-for-performance instruments. So I got the... let me just... conclude by saying there's a lot beyond pay for performance. Multitasking problem, this measurement problem, this sort of imbalance that you get if you have many tasks, it's just not coming only for pay for performance. There's career concerns and other drivers that can lead to problems. The Waterpoint Jewett and Tirol has a paper on it. There's a desire to be appreciated leads to influence costs that Milgram and Roberts have talked about. By the way, the asset ownership is an instrument, and we just heard Oliver talk about prisons. That's a multitasking problem, misalignment problem. And one of the things I just leave you with is the world, I think the nature of work is changing dramatically. And you have your phones. Some of you are reading your phones. You are multitasking. You know, you are not getting the valuable wisdom in this lecture. You know, it's a problem. And we can't. You know, that's one of the things that I think worry me a little bit is that you don't know what your workers are doing, but you may have to increase your punishment significantly for instance, trying to run a separate business. While you are doing something, you're actually using your mobile phone to run a couple of other businesses or whatever it is. And it turns out that punishments are getting extremely severe for this kind of activity. And that is also, it's going back to my original informative, that is actually the right thing from the incentive point of view too, because you don't have to do that. There's no error term in that sense, and therefore the punishment should be very severe. Thank you very much. Hold on. here, I forgot entirely that here I have my whole support troops. And Bob Wilson, you see, my advisor is in the top. We haven't written anything. Everybody else is a co-author. But Paul Milgram is to the left and Shanti Roll to the right. And Oliver got a prominent place. I do remember your name. And John Roberts, unfortunately, can't be here. But wonderful people. Gary is here. And I think that's the people who are here. Just wonderful people to work with. Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to invite Professor Hart to come up on stage. Ni kan väl gå fram dit till strålkastarljuset.